Hey everyone. So I wanted to talk about lesson 3, and specifically there's a section which talks about time series plots. So I found kind of an interesting plot on the internet. So maybe you've seen this. This went around the internet. I don't know, maybe it's just in statistics internet or science internet, but in Georgia, they put out this plot. So the Georgia, some government agency put out a plot where they were trying to talk about the potential of reopening after COVID-19, and they were saying, we're going to look at the top 5 counties where we have the highest number of cases and or it's the highest number of deaths and hospitalizations out of all the counties in Georgia. And so they chose these 5 counties and said, now we want to plot the number of cases over time up until the date that they were back when they were interested in this, which was sometime in May. And so they put out this plot. And so you should recognize this because you've been making some of these clustered bar charts. But there's something weird about this plot. And so if you've seen it before, maybe you know what that is. But if not, then maybe you can look at this and pause your video for the second and try to figure out what that might be. But if you don't see it right away, so you want to look at the x-axis. So on the x-axis, you've got the categories of these clustered bars. So the colors are actually the individual categories for each individual bar, and then each cluster has a label on the bottom. So usually when you make them in Minitab, it has two labels, like a row of labels and then labels underneath of that. So it labels the cluster and then it labels each individual bar. Here they're using colors and labels. So colors takes the place of one of those lines of labels. So, but if you look at the x-axis here, you'll see that they're dates. So we've got dates on the x-axis, and then weirder than that, the dates are not in order. So if you saw a chart that had dates on the x-axis, it would be really weird if all the dates weren't in the same order that they occur, right? So that's what's actually really weird about this plot. And a lot of people complained about this and said, this is a terrible plot. You need to redo this. This is so misleading. And they eventually did go ahead and remake the plot. Another weird thing about this also is that within each cluster, the bars are actually not always in the same order. They're reordered to make it go down. So like everything is just reordered to make everything look like it's going down. So it's not good plot making. So they did go back and remake the plot and put out a new one. And this was the one that they put out after that, which did correct the issue of having the dates in the correct order, and then also of having those colors are in the same order within each of the clusters. It's like, okay, that's fine. But you should remember that when we did clustered bar charts, we talked about that you use a clustered bar chart when you have 2 categorical variables. And date, we know, is not actually a categorical variable because it's quantitative, right? It's you can always get a smaller and smaller like time within each day. So date has this specific order, and we learned this lesson that we actually have a very specific plot that we can use when we're talking about dates, and that is the time series plot. So my argument would be that the way they should have done this is they should have completely gotten rid of the clustered bar chart, because a clustered bar chart doesn't make sense when you don't have 2 categorical variables. And they should have done a time series plot. Maybe it would look something like this. This is a little bit different because you've got new cases in Georgia, and then you've got the second line here is a 7-day average of the orange line. And then you've got dates on the x-axis, but this is a time series plot, and this is a lot easier to look at than this crazy thing. So if they would have remade this one they could use the same colors and then just do it in a time series way, it just would have been much clearer and easier for people to get information out of. So examples of not great sending out information using graphs, whatever you want to call that. So The other thing I wanted to talk about is pie charts. So I know that we talked about pie charts and you learned all about them, when to use them. And then I saw a lot of you using them on the lab, which was great. But I kind of wanted to point out, because I don't think the book goes into it. I haven't read that whole section, so maybe it does go into it briefly, but pie charts are actually not the best way to represent a lot of data. And I'll show you why that is. So here's an example of a pie chart. Oops, sorry. So here's a pie chart that has, I want to move my face, but I can't because my mouse isn't existent. Okay, that's fine. So there's 5 categories here, and they're just calling them A, B, C, and D. A, B, C, D, and E. And so they're different colors. And the weird thing about when you make colors and then you put different colors next to each other, we're actually not that great at figuring out how big things are when they're different colors, because the colors actually can kind of change how we're seeing things. So it's weird, but in this chart, like, it's really hard to tell, for example, whether B or C is bigger or whether C or D is bigger. It's just not, it's not easy to figure out which one is the biggest, and how we can order these by their value. So it's a little bit clearer when they're big, obvious differences, but in a lot of cases, they're not huge differences, and it's hard to tell with pie charts. We just have, like, humans have a hard time reading angles, and also different colors next to each other just can kind of mess things up. So if you're still not convinced, if you put 3 different pie plots, so these are all, they have different values, but it's hard to tell, like, how is D evolving? What is D, what is the proportion that is in D in the first as opposed to the second and the third pie chart? It's really hard to tell, right? So I would argue that bar plots are a lot better. Now, of course, if you put a pie chart on an exam or a quiz or a lab or whatever, it's not wrong. It's never going to be wrong. But when you go and use these things in practice, I would argue that bar charts are just much easier to read. So as you can see, there's actually a pretty big difference between these last 3 pie plots. So these are the bar charts that correspond to those 3 pie charts. And there's a pattern here that could be meaningful. So you might miss that if you only show the pie plots, you could be missing a lot of information. So there are a few alternatives to pie charts, actually. And so I wanted to kind of make you aware of some of those, because you can get really creative with using other types of plots. So on the left, we have a pie chart, and then on the right, we have what's called a donut plot. So it's really just taking that center out of the pie chart. And it can be a little bit easier to read than the pie chart. It's still not as great, in my opinion, as bar charts if you have differences that are small and hard to see. It still might be a little bit difficult with donut charts, but you'll see them pretty often. So yeah, we haven't learned how to make donut plots in Minitab. And so that's just something, you know, if in your future work you are interested in it, that's something you could look into. So also, of course, you can do a bar graph, and then also you can get kind of creative with it. So this is an example with women inequality. So it's talking about the proportion of women in government in different areas in the world, like Australia, North and Central America. So it's grouping very large areas, but then it's looking at what proportion of the leaders are female and presenting that in, I think this would maybe be called a waffle chart. Waffle charts usually have squares, but this is kind of like a take on a type of chart that has dots, and then the proportion of the dots that are colored in red are the proportion of correspond to the proportion of leaders who are women in these different areas of the world in government. So it's just kind of a creative way of not using a pie chart, but using something different. And also kind of, in this case, it kind of goes with the way that Parliament is usually seated around, you know, a center area. So it's kind of a take on that. So you can get really creative. with plots. It can be really fun. So here's an example. This is an article that came out in Significance magazine, which is an American Statistical Association magazine. And this is the entire article. I wasn't able to link to it, so I just put it all on the slide. And it's talking about with COVID-19, why it's really important that we take a simple random sample. So we learned about simple random samples and how they're great because you can use them to be, they're very representative of the population. If you take a simple random sample, you can make inference on the population that you took that simple random sample from. So a lot of people are arguing, you know, if we really want to know what proportion of people, say in the US, have COVID-19, we can't just keep testing people who are sick, because that's not going to give us a good proportion. That's not a representative sample. So what we need is a simple random sample. And so we've done p-hat, estimating a proportion. So if we want to estimate the proportion of a population who are infected, we need the top would be the number of people who are infected, which would be the sum of the number of symptomatic infections and asymptomatic infections in our simple random sample, and then divide that by the total number of people. So the total number of people who are tested. So number of symptomatic plus asymptomatic plus the number that were not infected. So we could estimate the proportion in the population who are infected by doing this calculation. But to do this, we would need data from a random sample of the entire population. And we would need that to be able to get people who are asymptomatic, symptomatic, and not infected, have them all have the correct proportion or the correct probability of being sampled. And some leaders are starting to do this. This was written, I think, in April, or maybe May. So it's not that updated, but it's definitely not being done that widespread, at least in the US that I know of yet. But hopefully that will change. So one reason for that is that the world still lacks the ability to test a large number of people. We don't have, tests are not in great supply. And then also a lot of leaders don't maybe value what a simple random sample is and what kind of meaning that would have and how that might really help to make policy decisions and really help our understanding of what's going on. So bottom line of this little article is just that we need more coronavirus tests than we think we need. So I hope you're all doing okay, and I hope you have a good week. See ya.